Okay, Dr. LaGuardia, when you're ready.
Okay.
Good luck, folks.
Well, good afternoon and welcome to the Joint Institute of International Relations and Catholic Commission for Social Justice webinar. First, let me again welcome you all and give a very sincere thanks to all the organizations, institutions, persons that have made possible this webinar to happen. My name is Dr. Jacqueline LaGuardia Martinez. I'm a lecturer at the Institute of International Relations, and I'm going to be the chair for this session. First, I would like to start by inviting Professor Jessica Byron, the director of the Institute of International Relations, to deliver welcome remarks to this session. Please, Professor Byron.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Dr. the Most Reverend Archbishop Charles Jason Gordon, Ms. Reita Toussaint, Permanent Secretary, Ministry of Foreign and CARICOM Affairs of Trinidad and Tobago, Professor Katarzyna Pisarska, Chair of the Warsaw Security Forum, who is joining us from Poland. Welcome. Mr. Sanjin Soldatich, Deputy Head of the European Union Delegation to Trinidad and Tobago. Ms. Joelle Ali, Head of the International Organization of Cooperation Office in Trinidad and Tobago. Ms. Lina Ramdien, Chair of the Commission for Social Justice, CCSJ. And our two colleagues from the Institute of International Relations and from the CCSJ who will make concluding remarks. Members of the Diplomatic Corps, government officials, members of the Institute of International Relations and the U.W.I community, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon and a warm welcome. It gives me great pleasure as Director of the Institute of International Relations to welcome all of you today to our joint IIR CCSJ webinar on the humanitarian implications of the Russia-Ukraine war. I would like to offer special congratulations and thanks to Dr. Anita Montut and Ms. Zara Weeks-Reiser and Dr. Mikhail Pavinsky, our staff members, and Ms. Leela Ramdien of the CCSJ for their excellent collaboration in the organization of today's event. Part of the mission of the Institute of International Relations is to keep the Trinidad and Tobago and Caribbean publics informed and critically aware of the implications and impacts of international events for our own region and for the global community of which we are a part. That mission is carried out not only through our teaching and training, our research and advisory activities, but also via the many collaborative partnerships that the Institute of International Relations has forged with the public and private sectors and with civil society actors. Our webinar today is a prime example of the very productive partnerships that we enjoy and that we seek constantly to strengthen, not only with regional state actors, but also with non-state actors like the CCSJ and international organizations and embassies in the Caribbean, and with international universities and think tanks, such as those represented by Professor Pisarska. A significant part of the IIR's value added is derived from our engagement with our wide network of partners. And we greatly appreciate their support and the opportunities provided to collaborate. This is a key part of our work, which we feel benefits our students and the University of the West Indies more broadly. Finally, a couple of reflections concerning Russia's war on Ukraine, which has unleashed one of the largest and worst humanitarian crises since World War II. The series of aggressions and human tragedy culminating in war crimes which we have witnessed since late February, will certainly have detrimental effects on global affairs for many decades. They have posed major challenges to foundational international norms like territorial integrity, non-aggression, peaceful settlement of disputes, and international humanitarian legal principles. These are all principles to which small states like our own hold dearly. They have severely set back the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals 2030 agenda, not only in Ukraine, but in many other countries and regions as well. The webinar we are about to participate in this afternoon will not only give us clearer insights into many of these challenges, but I hope will also help us to feel Ukraine's tragedy as fellow human beings and to carefully think through responses that reflect our sense of global responsibility. Moreover, there are many lessons that can be drawn from the Ukrainian humanitarian crisis and the responses that are being formulated and carried out that may be useful to us as we seek to respond and to develop policies for other humanitarian crises much closer to home in our own region. Thanks to all the panelists and all our audience for coming this afternoon. We look forward to a rich series of reflections. Thank you all very much and welcome again.
Thank you so much, Professor Byron, for these welcome remarks. I would like to invite now Ms. Reita Toussaint, Permanent Secretary at the Ministry of Foreign and CARICOM Affairs in the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago. Ms. Toussaint has been a career diplomat for 29 years and has held several positions at the Ministry of Foreign and CARICOM Affairs. She has also served at Trinidad and Tobago High Commission in London and permanent to the UN in Geneva, the later as Deputy Permanent Representative. Please, Ms. Toussaint, we would like to hear your welcome remarks, please.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, Dr. Jacqueline LaGuardia Martinez, Professor Jessica Byron, Director of the Institute of International Relations, Dr. the Most Reverend Archbishop Charles Jason Gordon, Archbishop of Port of Spain, Ms. Leela Ramdeen, Chair, Catholic Commission for Social Justice and Archdiocese Ministry for Migrants and Refugees, Ms. Jewel Ali, Head of Office, Project Coordinator, International Organization for Migration, Mr. Sanjin Soldacic, Deputy Head of Delegation and Political Officer of the Delegation of the European Union to Trinidad and Tobago, staff and students of the Institute of International Relations, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. I am here today on behalf of Senator, the Honorable Dr. Avery Brown, Minister of Foreign and CARICOM Affairs, to speak on an issue which has been a source of deep concern for us in Trinidad and Tobago. Before I do, I extend to you the Minister's appreciation for the invitation, his apologies for not being able to join you this afternoon, and his wishes for fruitful discussion during this webinar. You may all recall that from the first day of the military action by the Russian Federation in February, the Minister of Foreign and CARICOM Affairs registered the deep concern of Trinidad and Tobago over the events which have resulted in the unfortunate loss of life and has violated the peace and sovereignty of Ukraine. It has also caused disruption in the neighboring states that have received refugees fleeing the violence in Ukraine. Consistent with its foreign policy, Trinidad and Tobago is aligned on the side of peace and commitment to the tenets of the sanctity of the sovereignty and maintenance of territorial integrity of states, and condemns the outbreak of violence against Ukraine. We continue to call for the use of all available diplomatic channels to bring an end to this war. Today, that position remains unchanged. as Trinidad and Tobago continues to strongly urge Russia to cease all acts of aggression and to withdraw from the territory of Ukraine. Ladies and gentlemen, this issue is important not only for Trinidad and Tobago, but has also been explored at length regionally in the Caribbean community and internationally in multilateral forums such as the Organization of American States and the United Nations. Even as we all hope for a diplomatic solution to the crisis, the International Criminal Court is of the view that there is sufficient basis to launch an investigation into the alleged commission of war crimes and crimes against humanity in the territory of Ukraine. The findings that would lead to an investigation must be worrying to all who accept the sanctity of international human rights and subscribe to the fundamental tenets of international humanitarian law. While it is not for us to make any pronouncements on either the course or indeed the outcome of the prosecutor's investigation, Trinidad and Tobago expresses its continuing confidence in the will and the capacity of the court to execute its mandate in a just, independent, and impartial manner. We have all recognized that the invasion of Ukraine is causing untold loss of life and destruction of property for the civilian population of Ukraine, and has caused a growing humanitarian crisis. And this was one of the key reasons that Trinidad and Tobago agreed to support and co-sponsor, along with the Federal Republic of Germany, the French Republic, the Netherlands, Spain, United States of America, Japan, United Kingdom, and Canada, the United Nations resolution entitled Humanitarian Consequences of the Aggression against Ukraine. The resolution focused on the humanitarian needs as it related to supporting the efforts of the United Nations and its coordinating role, and humanitarian organizations to help the Ukrainian people, demanding an immediate cessation of hostilities, especially against civilians, urging humanitarian access, including food security worldwide, and encouraging the continuation of negotiations towards a peaceful resolution of the conflict. The decision to
Ms. Toussaint, you are unmuted.
I'm sorry, I didn't touch it. I'll continue. I'm not sure where you've not heard me, but I will continue.
Decision 2.
Okay, thank you. Our decision to co-sponsor the resolution was debated in the General Assembly on 23rd March 2022 in evidence of our staunch commitment to lending our voice in line with our foreign policy to the discussions which continue to take place in the General Assembly of the United Nations and which may lead to a resolution of the conflict. We all hope for this. Prior to that debate in the United Nations General Assembly on the 9th of March, Minister Brown sat with some members of the diplomatic corps and staff of the Institute of International Relations to discuss the crisis and its impact on the humanitarian situation in Ukraine. During that event, which was hosted by the High Commissioner for Canada, Minister Brown reiterated the government's concern about the grave humanitarian situation caused by the invasion of Ukraine and expressed particular disquiet about the circumstances faced by non-Europeans residing in that country. Minister Brown also indicated that the ongoing bombardment of Ukraine by the Russian forces and the potential for further escalation constituted a real threat to international peace and security, and is particularly inimical to the vital security interests of small states like Trinidad and Tobago, for whom stable, rules-based, multilateral world order is central to our existence, economic and human security. The situation is also worrying for us in our deliberations in CARICOM. At the close of the 33rd intersessional meeting of the Conference of Heads of Government of CARICOM, which was held in Belize in March, at the beginning of March this year, CARICOM heads emphasized that the organization has maintained a robust and unified position on the crisis. On the theme, War and Humanitarian Crisis in Ukraine, the heads condemned the military attacks and invasion of Ukraine by the Russian Federation. They also called for an immediate ceasefire and an end to all acts of aggression, as well as the urgent withdrawal of Russian military forces from Ukraine, and further encouraged the Russian Federation to resolve their concerns diplomatically and not through warfare. We also recognize the significance and importance of adhering to the Geneva Conventions of 1949, which remain relevant today. These conventions are among the most important treaties enshrining the principle that wars have limits. At the heart of the international humanitarian law, they bring protection to persons who are not or who are no longer participating in hostilities. Trinidad and Tobago is signatory to the conventions because we recognize that the tenets and respect for the sovereignty and sovereign equality of all states, non-interference and non-intervention in the internal affairs of other states, and respect for and adherence to international law and to the principles of the Charter of the United Nations must at all times be the guiding principles on which we stand and which Trinidad and Tobago is committed to upholding. So far, there is no signal of the imminent cessation of hostilities. And therefore, Trinidad and Tobago will, as we have done in our discussions within the Caribbean community, the Organization of the American States, and in the United Nations, continue to call for a return to and our strong support for the various agreements, which it is hoped will lead to finding a peaceful resolution and an early resolution to the conflict. Before I close, I wish you the best during this webinar. It is a most timely intervention, and I congratulate those who have collaborated to ensure that it is taking place today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Toussaint, for your remarks. I would like to invite now the panelists to start the session for the panel presentation. I would like to remind our panelists that you will have 10 minutes for your first for your presentation to give your remarks, and then we will have a session for question and answer. I will be introducing our panelists for each time they are invited to take the floor and to deliver their presentations. So I would like to start by introducing to you Professor Katarzyna Pisarska, who is a Polish social entrepreneur, civil activist, and academic. Professor Pisarska is the founder of the European Academy of Diplomacy, the Visegrad School of Political Studies, and a co-founder of the Kazimierz Pulaski Foundation at the Warsaw Security Forum. Currently, Professor Pisarska chairs the board of directors of the European Academy of Diplomacy and the Foundation Council for the Kazimierz Pulaski Foundation. So I would like now, after this introduction, to please welcome again and thanks Professor Pisarska and ask her to take the floor and deliver her presentation. Professor Pisarska.
Thank you very much and welcome everybody. It's a huge pleasure to be here with you. My warm greetings from Warsaw, Poland. On the front line, actually, of the conflict with Poland having accepted over 2.5 million Ukrainian refugees. Many of our Ukrainian friends actually working as I speak now in the offices around me because they have moved from Kiev, they have moved from Lviv, from many other cities to find shelter, but most importantly, to continue their important work on behalf of Ukrainian victory. But this is not what I will be talking about in my introductory remarks. I'll be very happy to maybe in the session of questions tell you more about the refugee situation here and of course what is happening here in Poland and in Ukraine as well. But I have been asked in 10 minutes, so I put on a stopper right now, to give a background, historical background to the conflict, to the war, to the Russian invasion in Ukraine. That seems a pretty impossible task to do, but I will do my best. And to keep me kind of in a framework, I will share a short presentation with you, which will help us basically also put together the most important information that I feel need to be stated here. So first and foremost, what do you have to know? And I think the narratives around the world about this conflict differ, and there's a very strong Russian narrative stating that Ukraine is not a state or has not been a state. And this is why Ukraine is part of Russian sphere of influence. Well, I have to say this is a false narrative because Ukraine has a long-standing history of a state, having been actually the conceiving state of the first Slavic tribes on the territory of the Kiev settlement, the Kiev kingdom, which for almost 9 centuries dominated the area of today's Ukraine, or partly. But it was also a country that shared common history for the good and bad with its neighbors, with Poland, with Lithuania being part of the Commonwealth, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. And it was only in the 18th century that Ukraine has felt under Russian rule. And of course, it became in 1922 actually one of the founding members of the Soviet Union. Much of that, of course, was done because Ukraine was invaded by the Red Army, by the Soviet Army, and kind of forced into the Soviet Union. It has gone through some tragical moments in its history, such as the Holodomor, which was basically a genocide committed on the Ukrainians by Stalin through an imposed famine on the country. It was overrun by Hitler. That is also a huge tragedy of Ukraine, with millions of people killed in the Second World War. And of course, after 1945, it had fell under Russian rule and became again part of fully the Soviet Union. It has not regained independence. It has not gained full independence until 1991. And that year really is the most important year for the modern Ukraine as we understand it. This was a country, again, with historical memory, especially the western part of Ukraine, which was at times part of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, part of Galicia, has had a very strong sense of national identity. And that national identity was slowly but firmly being built throughout the 1990s, with Ukraine first trying to balance its foreign policy between Russia and the West. But at some point, also because of a large Ukrainian migration, work migration, economic migration to Poland and to other EU member states, the kind of growing pro-European sentiment started to dominate. And it was reflected in the famous Orange Revolution, the peaceful Orange Revolution, where the elections in Ukraine were forged. People went on the streets, and thanks to among others, the European Union's intervention, there was a peaceful roundtable, and the elections were repeated and won by pro-democratic, pro-European forces. And this is also the year 2004, when Russia starts to begin feeling threatened by the Western Ukraine, by this growing pro-European sentiment in the country, and tries to pull back Ukraine from these plans to integrate more closely with the West. And at some point, 2013, it actually blackmails the president of Ukraine, Viktor Yanukovych, and offers him 15 billion euros of a loan for his electoral campaign, for a promise that he will not sign an association agreement, a free trade agreement with the European Union, which was already on the table, and Yanukovych does not sign the agreement on the day it was supposed to be signed. That is the reason of another big revolution in Ukraine. 2 million people go on the streets. It will be called the Euromaidan revolution because they want to be part of the European Union, because they see Yanukovych and Russia taking away the dreams of many to be more like the West, to be more like Poland, who is a country that started off in 1991 on the same GDP level as Ukraine. And yet in only 2 decades, thanks to the EU membership, has grown 3 times faster than Ukraine. So of course, people wish to follow the same path, and that path is seen as being taken away from them by their president, by rejecting this closer route of integration. And as a result of the Euromaidan revolution, Yanukovych is set aside, but that fact sparks the first invasion of Russia, first into Crimea in March, and a few weeks later into Donbas, and Crimea is taken over, annexed fully, and Donbas becomes a hot war that would continue until today. And of course, in the meantime, Ukraine changes immensely. So what Russia has been trying to prevent, pulling Ukraine closer to the West, actually happened. The exact opposite happens, because Ukraine, since 2014, is forced to conduct a war, be part of the war on its own territory against the Russian army, against separatists supported by Russia, but mainly also physically the Russian army on its territory. And of course, the last element of this story is the 24th of February 2022, where Russia, understanding after 8 years of a small-scale war that it is not gaining momentum in its goals, which I'll tell you about in just a second, decides to fully invade Ukraine, and the rest is, of course, history. You watch it on the news, you know the details. So what does Russia really want in Ukraine? And what does the Putin regime really want? First and foremost, as a realist power, as a power understanding the world international order through the realm of hard power, Russia wants the West and the world to recognize Ukraine as Russia's sphere of influence, which basically means subjugating the government in Kiev to Russia's power. That was also the first goal, as we know, of the invasion. A 2-3-day invasion was planned to install a puppet regime in Kiev and to take control over Ukraine. This has not realized because of the bravery of the Ukrainian people, because of the way that the Ukrainians started to understand that it is more than just, influence that Russia wants to destroy the entire Ukrainian identity and Ukrainian themselves, and thus the immense fierce opposition to the invasion. But Russia also wants abandoning by Ukrainians any wish to join the Western institutions, the European Union, NATO, and of course, a full demilitarization of Ukraine, which would basically mean its inability to defend itself. And of course, all this is sparked by the fact that, as you can see, even in the years 2011, 2013, where Viktor Yanukovych, a very pro-Russian candidate, was in power, and Ukraine was heading towards closer integration with Russia, even at that time, already almost half of the citizens wished to integrate more closely with the European Union. Today, I can assure you, these figures are in the 90s. Yes, today you will not find Ukrainians who would want to integrate with Russia, and even those that were strongly pro-Russian, after what has happened in the last days in Bucha and all the atrocities that are happening right now in the occupied territory, you can only imagine that these people no longer see Russia as a friend, as an ally, as the future of Ukraine. And this has been truly shown in the dynamic of positive attitudes of Ukrainians towards Russians, even after the Orange Revolution. So the first kind of pro-European revolution, most Ukrainians considered Russians as friends. 90% of Ukrainians said, well, you know, we have a positive view of Russia. However, these have changed immensely after the annexation of Crimea in 2014 and the Donbas war. And I think this is what Putin did not recognize, he did not understand. And it's amazing with all the Russian intelligence in the West and all around the world that Russian intelligence has not focused on the mood change in Ukraine. It has evolved immensely from perceiving Russia as a brother, as a friend, as a country that Ukrainians should be cooperating, to basically an arch enemy of the country, and thus this fierce resistance. Now, the last question, because my time is out, is of course, why does Russia want all this? Why does it want this war? And why it will not turn back? Because we have no illusions here in Central Europe that Russia is going to retreat unless it is pushed out of Ukraine. And it is because the very regime of Vladimir Putin is at stake here. He perceives the West and the fact that Ukraine turns pro-Western as a direct threat for the survival of his regime. He is threatened by the Western values, by democracy. Having a democratic Ukraine might spark in Russian minds the idea that maybe Russia also can be democratic, and that would, of course, mean a revolution in Russia. But you have a lot of the post-imperial phantoms, the Soviet Union phantoms, the loss of an empire that Russian people never actually were able to fully digest and come to peace with. And Ukraine is the biggest country in terms of significance of the former post-Soviet republics. And this is why it is also one of the main targets of this kind of renewed imperial thought of Russia. And last but not least, which is not insignificant, it is part of trying to consolidate the domestic public. I found this poll from 2014 extremely scary because this was still when polling was pretty possible in Russia. And for a question in Russia, whether do you think that there are parts of Russia's neighborhood that really belong to Russia, you could see that over almost 60% of Russians said agree or mostly agree. So there is a public sentiment, and there has been for a very long time, that Russia has lost territory it shouldn't have, that it should regain this territory. And again, Ukraine is here at the very heart of the problem. I will stop here because my time is up, but I'll be happy to answer any questions you might have later, and of course speak about the most important issue of today, which is refugees, Ukrainian refugees in Poland and other places. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Professor Pisarska. I would like to invite now Mr. Sanjin Soldatich, Deputy Head of the Delegation and Political Officer at the Delegation of the European Union to Trinidad and Tobago. Mr. Soldatich is a Croatian and European Union career diplomat, and he has been in that position since 2001. From 2009 to 2011, Mr. Soldatich was a press officer and speechwriter at the spokesperson office of the Croatian Foreign Ministry. From 2013 to 2015, he was posted at the permanent representation of Croatia at the European Union. From September 2020, he's again in the service of the European diplomacy as a deputy head of delegation and political officer. We thank again Mr. Soldatich to be here with us this afternoon, and we ask him to please share his thoughts in a 10 minutes presentation.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Dr. Jacqueline LaGuardia Martinez, thank you very much for the invitation to take part in this panel today. I want to also greet Professor Jessica Byron, Director of the Institute of International Relations, Madam Reita Toussaint, Permanent Secretary at the Ministry of Foreign and CARICOM Affairs, Dr. the Most Reverend Archbishop Charles Jason Gordon, Archbishop of Porto, Spain, Madam Lila Ramdin, Chair, Catholic Commission for Social Justice and the Archdioceses Ministry for Migrants and Refugees, Professor Katarzyna Pisarska, Chair of Warsaw Security Forum, and Madam U.W.I, Head of Office Project Coordinator, International Organization for Migration in Trinidad and Tobago. I also want to greet all online participants, and I would now start with my remarks. Unfortunately, war has returned to Europe. Airborne sirens can be heard again in one European capital, in one European country. The whole world is facing an unprecedented act of aggression by Russia against a sovereign, independent country. To talk about the war in Ukraine and its humanitarian implications today, I have divided my remarks in 4 different sections. The first is about the response of Trinidad and Tobago and CARICOM to the war in Ukraine. In the second part, I will speak about internal consequences of the war in Ukraine. By internal, I mean those that manifest both in Ukraine, but also in wider Europe, including, of course, in European Union, given that the many member states border Ukraine. In the third part, I will talk about the external dimension of the war and the negative impact on emerging and developing countries. And in the fourth part, I will take the liberty and talk briefly about my personal experiences of the war itself and this particular one in Ukraine. So I will start with the first part and the stance of Trinidad and Tobago. The magnitude of the war and its unprovoked and unjustified character has been recognized in our host country from the day one. We in the European Union delegation, and me personally, are pleased of your country position in the international fora, in particular in the United Nations General Assembly, where it not only voted in favor of 2 resolutions addressing the war in Ukraine, but it also co-sponsored them. We note also today's decision of the government of Trinidad and Tobago to abstain from the vote for the UNGA resolution suspending the membership of Russia to the Human Rights Council. The way we respond today to Russia's heinous attack will determine the future of Ukraine, of the European Union, of our entire continent of Europe, but very likely the whole world as well. Therefore, we must stay true to the principles that have guided our response so far. That is, responsibility, unity, solidarity, and determination. This is a moment of truth for Europe, but for the whole world as well. This is a clash between the rule of law and the rule of the gun, between democracies and autocracies, between a rules-based order and a world of aggression. I continue now with the second part and the internal humanitarian implications of the war. Today, it's the 42nd day of war in Ukraine. The war has already displaced millions of Ukrainians, leading to a sharp rise in humanitarian needs. The EU condemns in the strongest possible terms Russia's unprecedented military aggression against Ukraine. By its unprovoked and unjustified military actions, Russia is grossly violating international law and undermining European and global security and stability. The European Union deplores the loss of life and the human suffering, the massive, deliberate, and targeted aggression, and the accompanying atrocities committed by Russian armed forces against civilians is a humanitarian catastrophe, with the bombings of hospitals, theaters, shelters, and attacks on humanitarian corridors preventing the escape of civilians. Haunting images of large numbers of civilian deaths and casualties, as well as destruction of civilian infrastructures, show the true face of the brutal war of aggression Russia is waging against Ukraine and its people. Putin's war has already forced more than 10 million people to flee their homes following the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Over 6 million are displaced within the country, and over 4 million, the majority of them women and children, left Ukraine to neighboring countries like the Republic of Moldova, Poland, Romania, Slovakia, and Hungary. Approximately 1.2 million refugees have arrived in EU countries not bordering Ukraine. This is by far the fastest growing refugee crisis in the world, and now the biggest movement of people since the end of World War II in European countries. According to UN estimates, in total, 13 million people are estimated to be in urgent need of humanitarian assistance across the country. Civilians are paying the highest price of the illegal Russian military aggression on Ukraine. The estimated number of people stranded in affected areas or unwilling or unable to leave due to military action has risen to 12.65 million. Due to Russia's attacks, the humanitarian situation in Ukraine has significantly deteriorated and become a fully fledged humanitarian catastrophe. The worst situation is currently seen in the biggest cities under siege, especially Mariupol and Chernihiv, and along the former line of contact in Donbass. Hundreds of thousands of people do not have access to basic services, including water, electricity, and heating, while food supplies are running low. The situation of the vulnerable groups, including children, older persons, and persons with disabilities, requires particular attention. The preliminary assessments indicate that the main needs for the population in country are food, access to water, health, shelter, including support to collective centers of internally displaced people, sleeping equipment, and clothing and protection. All 27 EU countries, plus Norway and Turkey, are addressing these needs and have offered in-kind assistance ranging from medical supplies and equipment like ultrasound diagnostic devices, oxygen concentrators, patient monitors, infusion pumps and ventilators, but also protective material like masks and gowns. Shelter items, specialized equipment, vehicles, and energy equipment are being delivered as well. The items are being delivered both directly to Ukraine through the UN agencies, non-governmental organizations, and the International Committee of the Red Cross, and through logistical hubs established in Poland, Romania, and Slovakia. In response to this emergency, thousands of European families have opened their homes. Countless associations of NGOs are providing clothes, shelter, medicines, or are sending buses to drive Ukrainians to safety. The 27 member states of the European Union are sending out a very clear signal that they welcome refugees with open arms and will do everything they can to protect them. To help them, we have made sure that the European funds can be used with utmost flexibility in support of refugees. Almost in the first week of the war, EU members accepted proposal to activate the temporary protection mechanism to provide Ukrainian refugees with a secure status and access to schools, medical care, and work. All those fleeing Ukraine will immediately have residence rights in the EU. That means access to labor market, medical care, support, school. Of course, all EU countries bordering Ukraine are allowing entry also to all people fleeing war in Ukraine on humanitarian grounds, irrespective of their nationality. If third country nationals do not possess short stay visa for the EU, member states allow them to enter. They are also entitled to immediate assistance and immediate information about their rights. This includes temporary shelter and the fulfillment of the basic needs such as food and medicine. Further rights may differ depending on the status they will receive in the EU. And now to the third part, and it's about the external humanitarian implication of the war. The war has not only caused human suffering and has not only sparked an unprecedented wave of refugees. The consequences of the Kremlin's aggression of Ukraine span well beyond Europe. This war will have important repercussions for emerging and developing countries. The impact on the market for grain, wheat, but also maize, sunflower, and fertilizers, for which Russia and Ukraine were major exporters, will be significant. Ukraine is the granary of the world. Ukraine alone provides more than half of the World Food Programme's wheat supply. Countries like Somalia rely entirely on Ukraine and Russia for their wheat imports. Egypt imports 80% of their wheat from Russia and Ukraine. The prices of basic agricultural products were already high before the war. They will probably increase further with major potential for creating suffering and political instability. This Kremlin-made war is threatening food security across the world, and this is adding on an already dire situation. Humanitarian needs are at an all-time high. We risk entering a new age of famine in too many parts of the world. This is why the European Union, with its partners worldwide, requested to convene an emergency session of the Food and Agriculture Organization Council in Rome, including the agenda item implications on world food security and agriculture arising from the Russian aggression against Ukraine. Despite Russia's opposition, an extraordinary session of the Council will be held tomorrow. The war in Ukraine also has a very strong impact at raising energy prices, fueling inflation, and eroding the value of income, disrupting trade, supply chains. In the long run, war could fundamentally change the global economic and geopolitical order if energy trade changes, supply chains reconfigure, payment networks split, and countries begin to rethink the structure of foreign exchange reserves. All this increases the risk of unrest in several regions, from sub-Saharan Africa to the Caucasus and Central Asia. Our world is already shattered by too many conflicts, from Syria to Yemen, from the Sahel to Ethiopia, from Afghanistan to Myanmar. Food and energy prices are also the main channel of spillovers to the Western Hemisphere, with high commodity prices likely to significantly raise already high inflation rates in Latin America, the Caribbean, and the United States. Ladies and gentlemen, the whole world saw last two pandemic years that developing countries had been hit harder than developed ones by the economic impact of the COVID-19. World hunger and poverty had again increased significantly. The war in Ukraine may make things even worse in this respect, with the risk of major unrest related to food and energy price hikes, as we have already seen in the past in comparable circumstances. Despite our own difficulties, the European Union is very conscious that it must therefore increase support to poorer countries most affected by the indirect effects of this war. Therefore, the European Union has already set aside over 2.5 billion euros until 2024 to help the regions most affected by food insecurity. We will be readying a range of special measures to step up European food production, also in support of countries most in need. Europe is the world's largest humanitarian donor, and therefore we call on all others to step up their contributions too, because the world needs humanitarian action more than ever before. This is a moment for all of those who share a humanitarian spirit to join forces. And to my last part, and it's about personal reflections of the war. So far, I have talked about the material consequences of the war in Ukraine, about what the world community and the European Union are doing to respond to the many consequences of the aggression in Ukraine. Now, from my own experience, I will share my experiences with the consequences of war that remain in people much longer after the end of the war. These are intangible consequences. These are wounds that remain in people. Infrastructure is being rebuilt, but it takes much longer to heal wounds. I'm convinced that the Archbishop will talk about this aspect of a war, but allow me as well a few remarks. If I'm not mistaken, I have a unique experience among all the participants in today's panel. In Europe, we are very proud of the fact that we have managed to build the conditions for a peaceful life since the end of World War II. But that is actually not true in my case. Namely, in my 43 years, I have witnessed one war in Europe directly, and I'm currently witnessing another indirectly. My place of origin, my homeland, is Croatia, and 3 decades ago, it was also the target of unnecessary and ruthless aggression during the breakup of the former Yugoslavia, of which it was an integral member. Luckily for me, my hometown was outside the area of war activities, but I remember very clearly, vividly, the sound of air raid sirens and going to shelters. My mom who tries to keep calm, and me and brother who do not understand why instead of going to the playground to play basketball, we go to dark basement. My sufferings were incomparable to those of my compatriots who were left without their loved ones who had to leave their homes. I also remember the arrival of my peers, refugees at my school. As children, we don't understand their suffering, loss, anger, helplessness, pain. Over the years, I was able to become much more sensitive to their wounds. That is exactly what remains after the war. Wounds, long-lasting, sometimes incurable. For a large number of people in my country, their human development has been abruptly halted at a time when someone thought that cold force could solve problems. War is never the answer. War only multiplies problems. States continue relations after a while, but people carry their wounds with them. Wounds of the killed, missing, exiled, raped, beaten, tortured. The same thing will happen in Ukraine, but also in Russia. Human development will be stopped, prevented, and human capital may never be used to the maximum. Borders will open, but traumas will remain. Normalizing human relations requires a lot of investment, a lot of effort. Due to my private and business background in the territory of the former USSR, and especially in Russia, I follow the events of the war on a day-by-day basis with great sadness. Since as a diplomat, I was twice posted in Russia and spent 8 years in Moscow, both for the diplomatic service of my home country and the EU, I left behind certain memories of both countries, lots of friends and acquaintances, knowledge of Russian as well, which allows me to follow the war by consuming media content in Russian as well. Well, I'm not sure it does good to my psyche. It is already clear that the trench of intolerance between Russia and Ukraine will be very deep in the future. War generates only the worst, and the consequences are felt for generations. The consequences of this war are already worldwide, and especially if it spreads beyond the borders of Ukraine, it could also be felt for generations. I stop here and I thank you for your attention. Look forward to the Q&A session as well.
Thank you so much, Mr. Soldatich, and thank you for sharing your personal memories about the war. We really appreciate that personal testimony you have shared with us today. I would like to remind our audience that you can start posting your questions in the chat. We will be monitoring the questions so we can proceed with them at the end of the presentation of the panelists. I would like to introduce now Ms. Jewel Ali. Ms. Jewel Ali, through her 15 years tenure with the International Organization for Migration, has built a reputation of developing and maintaining close working relationships with local government authorities and diplomatic missions, UN agencies, regional, non-governmental, and international organizations. Prior to her tenure at the International Organization for Migration, she was a researcher at the United Nations Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, and a researcher and data manager at the University College London in 2002. Please, Ms. Ali, thank you so much for being with us today, and you can proceed to your 10 minutes presentation.
Madam Chair, Dr. Martinez, Professor Byron, Ms. Reita Toussaint, distinguished panel members, other specially invited guests, ladies and gentlemen, a pleasant good afternoon. I have the pleasure of providing you with what I have to describe as a very, very brief overview of the human rights of migrants and refugees and their violation in the Russia-Ukraine crisis. Let me begin by stating that IOM is deeply concerned about the ongoing war in Ukraine and joined the UN Secretary General's appeal for an immediate cessation of hostilities. Unfortunately and traditionally, in many policy debates, consultations, and various fora, the treatment and human rights of individuals as migrants, immigrants, and refugees appear more so in the footnotes. However, in news reports of death of migrants in tragic events or migrant workers treated unfairly, or in the current global events such as the Russia-Ukraine crisis, where persons find themselves in the midst of turmoil, the painful dimension of commonplace denial of the rights and dignity of migrants are made visible and articulated. This presentation will therefore be divided for ease in the same manner, which is to first look at human rights of migrants and refugees from a general but very brief perspective. Then I would hone in on the related matters specifically to the Russia-Ukraine crisis. While migration can be positive and an empowering experience for individuals and communities, and can benefit countries of origin, transit, and destination, it is clear that movement places people in precarious situations and is a serious human rights concern. What you could see from the diagram is human rights can often be a pull factor or even a push factor when it comes to migration. Additionally, and importantly, understanding human rights of migrants begin with the comprehension of how an individual with regular status can later become characterized under different types of migrants, leading to the who, what, why, and when they can afford certain rights. In principle, migrants enjoy the protection of international law. Key human rights instruments oblige state parties to extend their protection to all human beings. Such important treaties as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and others have been ratified by over 140 states. Where migrants fall outside the specific legal category of refugee, for example, it may be especially important to ensure their human rights are respected, protected, and fulfilled. Some migrants will need specific protection because the situations they leave behind, the circumstances in which they travel, or even the conditions they face on arrival, or because of personal characteristics such as their age, gender, identity, disability, or health status. Human rights. Human rights are non-negotiable elements that embody human aspirations. Individuals everywhere want the same essential things, such as food, shelter, clothing, to be free and allowed to live a life of dignity, to be assured justice, to live free of want and disease, to be able to speak freely, to practice their own religion or abstain from religious beliefs, etc. Human rights accrue to persons because they are human beings. These rights are indivisible, they're interdependent, they're inalienable, they cannot be taken away. They should be applied without discrimination. So no distinction should be based on race, color, sex, language, religion, political opinion, etc. Human rights are not absolute. Some rights can be derogated under certain circumstances. However, the ones you have on the screen are the rights that cannot be derogated, such as the right to life, freedom from torture, inhumane and degrading treatment. And the important takeaway from here is that human rights are applicable to migrants. While these rights are in fact applicable to migrants, it should be noted that human rights instruments do sometimes make the distinction between national and non-national, regular and even irregular migrants. The vulnerable situation that migrants face can often arise from a range of factors that may intersect or coexist simultaneously, influencing and exacerbating each other and also evolving or changing over time and circumstances. Migrants in vulnerable situations are those that I wish to ensure that we pay particular attention, as they are at risk of even more violations, abuse, and need assistance. The next slide, I just wanted to mention this. I think it's important. States to have, the right to determine how they admit non-nationals, they remove non-nationals, their border control measures, their security measures. And later, I would share with you how information from IOM's migration data portal shows how states have actually responded as a result of the Ukraine crisis. I'll not stay on the slide very long, except to say, I think we had some really good input already from fellow panel members that spoke about the situation in Ukraine. The only thing I wanted to add here is that over 2,000 third country nationals have already left Ukraine, and there are particular, and these third country nationals include students, foreign workers in Ukraine. What we do know is Ukraine has always been a destination for students and many immigrants from across the world. Over 80,000 international students, according to Ukrainian government data from different countries, from India, Morocco, Nigeria, Kenya. These students are from numerous countries who have immigrated, and now some of them actually have been working, and they find themselves desperately to leave and to get out of the war zone. With all the reports, we see what has been happening here, and I think Leela will probably address a lot more on the whole issue of discrimination. And discrimination is at the very heart of some of the human rights abuses that we see in Ukraine. Another category of migrants I wanted to mention here is really migrants who are in detention center in Ukraine. And there are reports from the Human Rights Watch that in excess of 100 migrants belonging to over 50 nationalities still remain in detention centers. And I think we've seen also the reports of what happened with them when they tried to leave. So just putting the spotlight that, there are many vulnerable persons. Of course, you have the Ukrainian nationals who would be refugees, but then you have other persons trying to leave who may not fall under that international protection, and they are also vulnerable and in need of assistance. In terms of the other slide, the UN continues to monitor the human rights situation in Ukraine through the Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine, which is documenting civil casualties and the impact of hostilities, monitoring freedom of movement, and reporting on allegations of violations. In March 2020, IOM stated that there have been verified credible reports of discrimination, violence, and xenophobia against nationals and third country nationals attempting to flee the conflict in Ukraine. Discrimination on the basis of race, sex, ethnicity, nationality, and migration status, including migrant workers and students living in Ukraine, are facing acute challenges as they attempt to leave these conflict areas, cross borders into neighboring countries and seeking life-saving assistance. The discrimination results in heightened risk and suffering and the ability to seek safe and easy refuge. As I said before, I think Leila will go in greater detail on this issue, so I will move on in the interest of time. The next slide will show that, based on the reports and observation we see from the Ukraine-Russia crisis, we could see that there are many human rights being violated. We just try to show some of them. In terms of the global response, we are happy to see that a number of states would have stepped up. For instance, Argentina would have indicated that they will grant Ukrainian nationals humanitarian visas. Brazil launched a scheme for Ukrainians where they can remain for 2 years. Canada launched 2 immigration schemes for Ukrainians. United States designated Ukraine for temporary protection status for 18 months. United Kingdom, the European Union, you would have heard a bit more of that earlier. In terms of IOM's response and the rest of the UN system is definitely scaling up the delivery of life-saving support to the people of Ukraine, particularly women, children, elderly people, and those with disabilities. Specifically, the IOM is mobilizing teams and boosting capacity in Ukraine and in neighboring countries to respond to the growing humanitarian needs of Ukrainians forced to flee the countries, those internally displaced, and stranded third country nationals. The organization's #1 priority is the safety and protection of all those fleeing the country, including third country nationals, and their ability to access assistance. IOM is also constantly and continuously screening and assessing potential short and long-term vulnerabilities, including for human trafficking, child protection, health, mental health, and the arrival of more vulnerable persons with specific needs, including the elderly, wounded, and sick people. I wanted to just briefly show the slide, which basically is IOM's Migration Crisis Operational Framework, which we call MICOF. It's a practical, operational, and institutional-wide tool to improve and systemize the way IOM supports its member states and partners to better prepare for and respond to migration crisis, and illustrates how and who it works to assist in particular migrants caught in crisis. Now, what is important about this is that, very often in terms of human rights and the human rights of migrants in particular, you do have states that have already adopted these international, conventions and all these international instruments. What you do have an issue with often is really how do you translate these things into the national legislation, and more importantly, how do you operationalize these things? And this is why this tool is so important, and you can actually use this tool not just for responding to an active crisis such as what we have in Ukraine, or even after a crisis, but even before in terms of planning. But I'll probably need an entire day to go through all of this. The only thing else I would want to mention about this is that, it basically looks at practical ways. It looks at all the partners and the roles that they can play, all the international partners, and it could really help states plan for as well as respond to migration crises. I'm almost to the end. Now, the recommended approaches to ensuring human rights are recognized and protected is to, and I started to some of it, preempting my own slides, translate international law standards into robust national legal frameworks, apply non-discrimination principle to non-nationals, integrate human rights of migrants in all policy areas such as security, health, education, trade, labor. Another important approach is to build capacity for effective implementation of human rights standards. It promotes human rights, which we all need to do together, prevent abuse, ensure protection and redress. Thirdly, to ensure policy coherence on issues of migration and human rights. So looking at migration, development, human rights, nexus should be captured in policy. Assess the potential effect of restrictive migration policies on the occurrence of human rights violations. Migration management does not equate to control, but rather facilitation and balancing and harnessing the benefits of migration. Ensure a whole of government approach through interministerial cooperation. And then one of the other recommended approaches is to meet the protection and assistance needs of trafficked persons and exploited migrants. Finally, I close by saying we all must work together at all levels and at all stages of migration. We need to move. Theory is important. Of course, international conventions are extremely important. We need to get to practice and to implementation. We need to protect the human rights of migrants at any time, and particularly in times of crisis when they tend to be some of the most vulnerable. And then, of course, but as with any type of assistance, you need to empower the migrants themselves. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Ms. Ali, for this first introductory presentation about the vision of the International Organization for Migration and its policies. I would like now to invite Ms. Lila Ramdin, who is an attorney at law, education consultant, Episcopal Delegate Chair of the Catholic Commission for Social Justice, and Chair of the Archdiocese's Ministry for Migrants and Refugees in the Archdiocese of Port Spain, Trinidad and Tobago. For nearly 5 years, until January 2020, Ms. Ramdin has been appointed by the President of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago as a lay assessor on Trinidad and Tobago Equal Opportunity Tribunal. So thank you so much, Ms. Ramdin, for being with us today, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, Dr. Martinez. A pleasant good afternoon to Dr. the Most Reverend Archbishop of Port of Spain, Charles Jason Gordon, Professor Jessica Byron, Director of the Institute of IIR at U.W.I, Ms. Reita Toussaint, Permanent Secretary of the Ministry of Foreign and CARICOM Affairs, Professor Katarzyna, Ms. Pisarska, Chair of the Warsaw Security Forum, Mr. Sanjil Soldatic, Deputy Head of the Delegation on European Delegation and Political Officer, Trinidad and Tobago, Ms. U.W.I, Head of Office, Project Coordinator, International Organization for Migration. Good afternoon also to all participants of this webinar. I want to make it clear that CCSJ and AMMR, like the rest of the Catholic Church, condemn Russia's invasion of Ukraine and continue to call for an end to this war and for peaceful solutions to be found to resolve any disputes. Pope Francis has said, war is madness, and that those who make war forget humanity. War, he says, is a failure of politics and of humanity, a shameful capitulation, a stinging defeat before the forces of evil. In a media release on Thursday the 3rd, Antonio Vitorino, Director General of IOM, called for discrimination and racism against third country nationals fleeing Ukraine to end. He stated, "I am alarmed about verified, credible reports of discrimination, violence, and xenophobia against third country nationals attempting to flee the conflict in Ukraine. Let me make it clear," he said, "discrimination on the basis of race, ethnicity, nationality, or migration status is unacceptable. I deplore any such acts and call on states to investigate this issue and address it immediately." The discrimination of third country nationals in Russia-Ukraine crisis, as far as we're concerned, highlights how entrenched racism is in our world. The President of the European Commission tweeted on March the 2nd, "Europe," she said, "stands by those in need of protection. All those fleeing Putin's bombs are welcome in Europe. We will provide protection to those seeking shelter, and we will help those looking for a safe way home." However, as we know, the reality on the ground is somewhat different. As Daniel Howden states in his article in UK Guardian on March the 10th, entitled "Europe," he says, "Europe has discovered compassion for refugees, but only if they're white." A statement issued by the African Union condemned reports about the treatment of Africans as shockingly racist and in breach of international law, and observed, "All people have a right to cross international borders during conflict, and as such should enjoy the same rights to cross to safety from the conflict in Ukraine, notwithstanding their nationality or racial identity." The media has brought into our homes images of some African students being dragged out by their hair from lines of persons waiting to cross into Poland and being brutally beaten. Osa Ruben, a father of 3 and a Nigerian national, said he and his family were asked to give up their seat on a cross-border bus out of Ukraine, with the driver and military officers using the phrase "no blacks" as justification. He said this isn't happening just to black people, but also to Indians, Arabs, and Syrians. That shouldn't be the case, he said, reported in UK's independent newspaper. Nigerian President Advisor Garba Shehu referenced a video on social media showing a Nigerian mother with a young baby being physically forced to give up her seat. He rightly stated that all who flee a conflict situation have the same right to safe passage under UN Convention, and the color of their passport or their skin should make no difference. These are just a few of the many reports of racism perpetrated against African, Asian, and Middle Eastern persons fleeing war in Ukraine. Discrimination of non-nationals in Russia-Ukraine crisis can also be seen in the way in which the media has been reporting the issue and what media houses choose to report. Dr. Rashad Ritchie, as some of you may know, is an online TV host in America, said, according to the Education Ministry, Ukraine is home to tens of thousands of African students studying medicine, engineering, and military affairs. Morocco, Nigeria, and Egypt are among the top 10 countries with foreign students in Ukraine. Together, these 3 countries supply over 16,000 students. Thousands of Indian students are also trying to flee. Here are some of the comments made by journalists reporting on the war. Mustafa Bayoumi, who is the author of a few award-winning books, reported in the UK Guardian on March the 2nd that while on air, CBS News senior foreign correspondent Charlie D'Agata stated, "Ukraine isn't a place, with all due respect, like Iraq or Afghanistan that has seen conflict raging for decades. This is a relatively civilized, relatively European city, one where you wouldn't expect that or hope that it's going to happen, that you wouldn't expect this." Righteous outrage immediately mounted online from people who objected to this, and he quickly apologized. An ITV journalist reporting from Poland said, now the unthinkable has happened to them. And this is not a developing third world nation. This is Europe. In an interview with the BBC on February the 27th, Ukraine's deputy chief prosecutor said, "It's very emotional for me because I see European people with blue eyes and blonde hair being killed." And Kelly Kobilia, NBC News correspondent, said on TV on March 1st, "These are not refugees from Syria. These are refugees from neighboring Ukraine. They're Christians. They're white." Bulgaria's prime minister said, "These are not the refugees we're used to. They're Europeans, intelligent, educated people. Some are IT programmers. This is not the usual refugee wave of people with an unknown past. No European country is afraid of them." Dr. Rashad Ritchie has rightly said that the Black people fleeing are human beings. Bias, prejudice, systemic racism are on display in international journalism. Mustafa Bayumi says, if we decide to help Ukrainians in their desperate time of need because they happen to look like us or dress like us or pray like us, or if we reserve our help exclusively for them while denying the same help to others, then we have not only chosen the wrong reasons to support another human being, we have also, and I'm choosing these words carefully, he said, we have shown ourselves as giving up on civilization and opting for barbarism instead. My friend Peter Herbert, OBE, a British barrister, part-time immigration and employment tribunal judge, and a former member of the Anti-Racist Alliance, of which I was co-chair in the UK for many years, wrote a moving piece on Facebook in response to the following statement made by someone in senior position in Britain, who, particularly because of his position, should apologize for the blatant racism inherent in it. This is the statement. The person said, it's rather normal to see war and bloodshed in Africa and Asia, but not in Europe. This is very alien to Europe. We forgot about the Holocaust and about World War I and II. On the 29th of March, I became aware of another development. Adrian Lawrence, author and attorney at the TYT network, in America's largest online news network, reported that there's a new report that states that dozens of non-white Ukrainian residents who fled the conflict are now being held in long-term detention facilities in Poland and Estonia. And Ms. Giuliani referred briefly to that. She showed images of one of the detention centers sent courtesy a joint investigative report by Lighthouse Reports, Independent UK, and other journalism outlets. She said the experiences in these camps are being documented and they are harrowing. One of the students said he was stopped by officials as he and others crossed the border and were given no choice but to sign a document they did not understand before they were taken to the camp. They do not know how long they'll be held there. They feel like they're being kidnapped and are not being given an opportunity to contact the outside world. She shared a report from some of the students. A Nigerian student said his phone was taken away from him. He was given a form to sign written in Polish, and he was told that he would go to jail for 5 months if he didn't sign it. He was taken to court. There was no interpreter to translate in the court. He couldn't understand what was being said, and then he was taken to the detention center. Lawrence rightly says, this is going on despite an EU protection directive that was issued on the 4th of March that stated that any kind of third world national studying or working, living in Ukraine should be admitted to the EU temporarily on humanitarian grounds. And this directive also is supposed to help refugees fleeing the invasion to stay in whatever country they end up in, at least for a year, to have access to education as well as work there. So in a letter to a member of parliament, a European Parliament in mid-March, Polish border police confirmed they are holding at least 52 third country nationals. The court, which takes the decision each time to place people in the centers, is the court that makes that decision. And there are a number of African embassies in Poland trying to get their people out. Ukraine refugee crisis really highlights racism in the heart of human beings. Maybe this is what the Ukrainian, when we asked about the reports of racism, the Ukrainian ambassador to United Kingdom said, maybe we will put all foreigners in some other place so that they won't be visible. And then there won't be conflict with Ukrainians trying to flee in the same direction. There's a wonderful article by Howard Johnson and Asen from a university in Canada. And they pose a number of questions. Genuine change, they said, begins with a reimagined notion of what it means to be human. They ask us really, what does it mean to be human? What will it take for us to recognize everyone's humanity, vulnerability, and dignity without condition? On the 28th of February, CCSJ issued a media release in which we stated, we stand in solidarity with our brothers and sisters in Ukraine who are victims of this invasion, as well as citizens in Russia and various parts of the world who are protesting the invasion. But at the same time, justice demands that we also stand in solidarity with our African and Asian brothers and sisters who, according to media reports, are bearing the brunt of racism in Ukraine. It was Pope Benedict XVI who reminded us that true solidarity begins with an acknowledgement of the equal worth of the other. Humanity is one. Martin Luther King rightly told us, hate cannot drive out hate, only love can do that. Loving our neighbor has global dimensions in an interdependent world. We believe that peace is possible, but only if we open our hearts to let love in for our neighbor, of all ethnicities. So let us work together to build a more just and peaceful world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Ramdin, for this passionate and necessary perspective on what is going on in terms of this humanitarian crisis. Finally, in this section for presentations, it is my pleasure to invite the Most Reverend Archbishop Charles Jason Gordon to take the floor. We appreciate very much that you are sharing your time with us today, Archbishop. And I also would like to ask you, since you are the closing panelist, to give some comments and ideas in general about the comments that we have been listening during this afternoon. I will ask you also to please do not take more than 12-15 minutes so we can have time for question and answer sessions. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you very much. All protocols have been observed. I welcome, I thank, and I greet all the distinguished panelists, the hosts. Rich food for thought from so many perspectives, from Europe in Poland, and from Lila looking on at the humanitarian crisis from a perspective of race and racism. I'd like to share a slightly different perspective to what we have heard so far. War is never great. War means that humanity has failed in being human, that we have failed in finding the ways to negotiate past whatever the challenge we are facing at this moment. The Holy Father, Pope Francis, launched another powerful appeal for an end to the barbaric and sacrilegious acts of war, warning that war does not devastate only the present, but future of society as well, pointing to statistics that shows half of all Ukrainian children are now displaced. The Pope said that what this means is to destroy the future, causing dramatic trauma in the lives of the smallest and the most innocent amongst us. Again, he says war should not be something that is inevitable. We should not accustom ourselves to war. Instead, he said, we need to convert today's dadism into a commitment for tomorrow. He called on all political leaders to commit to putting an end to war. And we've all heard it, that this crisis has deep tragedy. The tragedy of the child, the family, of those who are from other parts of the world who are discriminated against, the tragedy of a people being displaced, the tragedy of a people that have not been allowed to chart their own course in history because someone else has a different idea about them and what they should be doing. This is a humanitarian crisis beyond all measure that we've seen since the Second World War. There are charges of war crime already. There's a refugee crisis that we've heard of major proportion. Civilians are being targeted and attacked with no compunction whatsoever. So I want to start by saying clearly this is a humanitarian disaster. But I want to look at another part of it. I subscribe to a view of history of the Annales School. Ferdinand Braudel is a French group of historians that were very active in the pre-Second World War and really culled their skills after the Second World War. They look at history not just as a moment or the event. They want to look at the 500-year perspective. They also want to look at what would be called the Congress cycle, a 100-year or 70-year cycle that has led up to where we are. And if you look at development and integral human development, I would say that the real challenge is not just what we're seeing before our eyes today, but that for the last 500 years, the West has not had a great model of authentic integral human development. It has been operating out of an inadequate model. And this model has precipitated internal conflicts within nations and internal conflicts between nations every time the system breaks down and every time the system comes to a deep, deep impasse. Integral human development is the development of each person, of every dimension of the human person. That means the Russian person, the Ukrainian person, the Nigerian person, the African person, the Asian person, the Caribbean person. It must apply to all people. And development must be seen as a goal not only for all people, for all nations. The easiest way to negotiate an ethical framework is do unto others as you would have them do unto you. But we know that the dominant nation has a cycle, and that cycle produces instability, and whenever the instability comes, war comes after it. And once the dominant nation is the currency that guarantees all global trade, which happened the American dollar after Bretton Woods, it becomes very smug. What then happens? It happened to Venice in the 1600s, the Dutch in the 1800s, to England in the 1900s. Now it's happening to the US in the 2000s. And when this happens, each time a government that is dominant gets into this problem, what it does is it prints money because it can't raise enough taxes. And out of that, then money becomes devalued. Out of that, prices soar in stocks, gold, and other commodities. And what ultimately happens is conflict inside of the country and conflict outside of the country. This is a pattern that has been happening for 500 years. Now, it happened more recently, 2008. There's a big print of money in 2007, bringing a crisis in 2008. It happened again in 2020. And 2021, out of the COVID crisis, a big print of money again for the pandemic relief. But if you look back to the 1920s, there was a print of money, a big bust in the 1930s. And then in 2007, the bubble was bursted in 2008. What happens is two things. First, there is an internal order that is set within nations, but there's also a world order that is set. The internal order usually changes after some form of a revolution. Example, the American Revolution in 1789, and where the Constitution still holds, and so the internal order still holds, or the Russia in 1917, which ended in 1991 with the collapse of the Soviet Empire, or the Chinese Communist that won the Civil War in 1949, and that internal order still holds. But there's also an external order. The last external order was set in 1940 with Bretton Woods, and it ended Britain's domination of the world and Britain setting the economy and being the currency of economic trade, and began with the US setting the currency and being the dominant force within the world. The current crisis has to be seen from the perspective of a changing world order. The US is on the decline, China is emerging as a new power, and that has brought another form of tension within our world. And because we have been working with an inadequate development model that looks at the development of my people, or people who are like me, or people who are in the core, and punish people who are in the periphery, what happens is whenever this world order starts changing, internal and external conflict emerges, and it results ultimately in war. Invading a Soviet country, a sovereign country, can never be justified. But if you look at Russia and you ask how Russia has seen the world of the West for the last 25 years with the dominance of American power, it would be seeing it different from how we see it looking at Western media. The former Soviet states have become NATO members, many of them. And this is seen by Russia's provocation. So if we're going to do unto others as they would have us do unto them, then we have to see that there are things that have implied in this war that have been going on for a fairly long time. And that never justifies the event, the act, the decision, the crisis, and the humanitarian crisis that we are now plunged in because of this. The threats to Russia over the last few hundred years, so the Poland occupation of the Kremlin in the 1700s, the Swedish invasion of Russia in the 1800s, Napoleon in the 1900s, and Germany in the 20th century. So this is kind of the backdrop of the Russian mind. But in 1990, when the Soviet Union was collapsing, George Bush offered Russia that if Germany became part of NATO, NATO would never expand further east than East Germany. And that was the deal. But Russia demolished the Warsaw Pact, but NATO never held its part of its deal, and it kept expanding. So Putin has said that the frontline forces of our borders, this expansion represents a serious provocation that reduces the level of mutual trust, and we have a right to ask, against whom is this expansion intended? And what happened to the assurance our Western partners made after the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact? Now, in June 1997, 50 prominent analysts of the West told President Clinton that the continued push to expand NATO was a historic error, and an error of historic proportions. And successive American presidents ignored the warnings. They kept pushing for the expansion, and here we are today. Russia saw all former USSR as joining NATO as both a threat and an embarrassment. And here is where national ideology goes wonky, because Russia cannot understand that Ukraine is a sovereign nation that wants to chart its own destiny. But I suppose that America wouldn't understand if Mexico wanted to be part of Russia, or Cuba wanted to have missiles installed on it, that would be a good thing for the world to have and world peace to have. Several American diplomats, former secretaries of state, have said that this thing is not good. Stobel Talbot says many Russians see NATO as a vestige of Cold War. They point out that they have disbanded the Warsaw Pact, and ask why the West should not do the same. What I'm proposing here is that we have a conflict that has many levels that we have to look at it from. On one level, it is a tragedy of arrogance of one man or state believing that another nation should comply to their wishes, and therefore attacks, invades, and creates a humanitarian crisis. On another hand, what we have is two major nations where, when one was in decline, the other one, rather than doing what was done for Germany after the Second World War, and embracing and finding ways for authentic development of that nation, what happened was a humiliation, a discrediting, and an embarrassing, and a threatening of that nation that creates a tension that leads us now to where we are, which is on the brink of a war that we can all regret if it goes as bad as it could. We are in a very difficult time. And what we're facing here could be a minor skirmish between two nations that resolves itself over the next few weeks. And we return with a deep breath and horror with what we have seen in the interim to a fairly settled order that has existed and continues to exist. I fear, however, that what we are witnessing is a change in world order. In which case, this could be a third world war, in which case this could drag other nations in. I don't know which way it's going to go. But what I do know is in the 1300s, Venetian capitalism formed itself out of a war, and Dutch capitalism in the 1600s, and British capitalism in the 1800s out of the French-English War, and American capitalism out of the Second World War. And each time the major conflict happens, capitalism changes geographical center. And each time the atrocity to the human and to the people who are involved is horrendous. I'm proposing that we look at this war, yes, from a developmental perspective of the person, of the nation, of the community of nations in this world, but also of the changing world power, the tectonic plates that are shifting right now in an old order on decline and a new order emerging, and how dangerous that is. Because each time this condition has happened in the world over the last 500 years, the results have been terrible. The human people who suffer, we have to do everything possible to help them through this crisis. And it's wonderful to see how Europe has opened its doors to receive the migrants. But as Leela has pointed out, that human development and that capacity for reaching out to another and for embracing another has not been equally demonstrated for all peoples in crisis around the world. And hence, we keep having a world where injustice breeds the next ferment that breeds the next way of conflict. And the way forward here is we have to find a way where we treat others as we want to be treated, and create a world where fairness and where the fairness of recognition really becomes the way that we operate within our world. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your words. I would like to let know our audience that it is not strange that the Most Reverend Archbishop has been able to bring all the presentations together and making the remarks using this conceptual and theoretical framework, because it is a former lecture in Caribbean history, social ethics, media, Caribbean theology at the seminar of St. John Vianney and Uganda Martyrs. And also the Archbishop is currently the principal of the Caribbean School for Catholic Communications in Trinidad. And I'm sure you are all aware that we can read his weekly column in the Catholic News entitled Conversation with Archbishop. So thank you very much to all our panelists. I'm going now to share different questions that we have been able to collect in the chat, and I will be directing the question to our panelists considering the time we have. So first, I will read them all, and I will indicate, please, which panelist should please share their thoughts in about 2 minutes answer. I know it's challenging, but let's do our best. Well, first for Professor Pisarska. Our lecturer, Mikhail Pavinsky, would like to know about the following question. Today, the Ukrainian foreign minister illustrated the willingness of the European Union and NATO member states to assist Ukraine in the defensive war against Russia as banging the head against a wall. Are the European Union and NATO member states doing enough in support of Ukraine? What more should be done? I would like also then to ask Mr. Soldadish this question from one of our students. From a gender discrimination perspective, how is the conscription of men between 18 and 60 in Ukraine viewed? What is your views on that? Also, I would like to ask to Ms. Ali about the question of the foreign nationals from Caribbean islands who have been displaced as a result of the war. Is there any information that the International Organization for Migration has at the moment? What are the information statistics you may have on that? Finally, I'm going to share, well, I will ask first these questions to be answered, and then we will go to the second and final rounds of questions. So please, Professor Pisarska, could you share your thoughts on the question that you have?
Yes, thank you very much, Jacqueline. I would start, however, with trying to reflect on something that the Archbishop has said, and I deeply disagree with, mainly trying to apologize, be apologetic when it comes to what Russia is doing currently. We have yesterday seen an independent group of independent observers confirmed mass graves of 300, 400 people in Bucha. We have seen these observers confirmed 3-year-old children being raped and killed in Bucha, on top of women, men, elderly. To say that these crimes, well, somehow should be understood because NATO has been enlarged, I cannot agree with that at all. First of all, NATO has not expanded. We as Poles in 1919 begged the West to allow us to NATO. We've begged the West. We had the whole advocacy campaign in the Congress with Bill Clinton, among all our Western neighbors, to take us into NATO. And there was not much willingness to take us into NATO for many reasons, but we begged. Why did we beg? Because we knew that the Russians will come back. We knew that they will do what they are doing today in Ukraine. They are committing a mass genocide on the occupied territories only because Ukraine is not in NATO. So again, I would also be very interested in even hearing from our Croatian friend. Croatia is in NATO. Has anybody forced Croatia to join NATO? No, it's a strategic choice of any independent nation to decide which side we ally. And NATO for us, just like the European Union, being part of and a member of the European Union means protection, means prosperity, means being equal at the table. And I think the Ukrainians deserve that choice. They never were given the choice. Nobody promised them NATO enlargement, and they today suffer the most. And when it comes to the question I was asked, is the EU and NATO doing enough for Ukraine? Of course not. I have to agree that we've never done more. There's never been more unity in the West. There's never been more profound sanctions. But today, Ukraine is fighting a war on behalf of us. I have no doubt, and nobody in this country has a shadow of a doubt, just like in Estonia, in Lithuania, in Latvia, that if Putin gets his way in Ukraine, we're next. We're next to be invaded. We are next to be subjugated. So in that sense, we should be doing everything possible. It's clear we're not going to go on the ground with our troops there, but there should be much more military assistance given to Ukraine for Ukraine to be able to defend its own sovereign territory, which is doing, incredibly with the very few resources that it currently has. So of course, we're trying to help on the humanitarian side. We're trying to do as best as we can. And if there's any type of racism involved, which I have been aware of these cases, then we are deeply sorry. These should be resolved immediately when it comes to refugees. But we're really trying to do what we can, having 2.5 million people here coming in the last 20-30 days into Poland. But again, much more has to be done on the ground for Ukraine, as the Ukrainians are asking us to do, to help their military effort to stop this invasion, to stop this atrocity, to stop this genocide. Thank you.
May I come next?
Yes, of course. We are going to follow the order, and then we will allow our two late panelists to, of course, come and react. So please, Mr. Soldarich, this is your turn to react now.
Yes, thank you very much. I see we don't have much time left, so I will very briefly subscribe to all what Professor Pisarska said. With all due respect to Archbishop, but there is no justification to any aggression to any sovereign country. NATO enlargement. Nobody was pushing NATO to go to Eastern Europe, to Baltic states, to the Balkans. We wanted to get into NATO. That was a strategic interest of Poland. That was a strategic interest of Croatia. We applied for the membership. We got it. We now see the advantages and disadvantages of that, but it was our sovereign decision to join those integrations. I can also ask after the 1990 and what happened to Soviet Union, why none of these countries in Eastern Europe and in Baltic states remained with Russia, why nobody wants to have close relations with Russia. They all decided to go west, whatever that west is, and wherever the borders of west are, but they are not advocating for the West. They are advocating for democracy, rule of law, accountability, transparency, all these that we stand for. On the concrete question, on the conscription of men from 18 to 60, war, unfortunately, I'm not an expert in human rights. I will answer this question from a common sense, and my common sense is telling me that a war is extraordinary time, extraordinary circumstances, and in that time, president can even declare a martial law. Part of that martial law is general conscription of all men from 18 to 60. Ukraine has to defend Ukrainians have to defend their country, and I'm sure that President Zelensky was not happy to adopt this decision, but this was necessary in these circumstances. And I also subscribe to what Professor Pisarska said on treatment of people, mistreatment of people on any grounds in Europe. We, of course, from the European Union, we condemn all such actions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Soldadic. And this to finalize this.
May I, excuse me, if I may, one more remark, very briefly. I was posted to Russia. I know a bit about Russia. This myth that somebody promised Russia in 91, 92 that NATO will not enlarge to east. I'm sorry, but that's not true. There was I can send you a link, I will find, but there was a statement by Mr. Gorbachev, who was very involved in all what was going on in the beginning of 90s, saying no one ever promised this to Russia, to Soviet Union.
May I just add one very brief thing? I just wanted to, about the conscription. Our border guards have counted that there has been actually 400,000 returns to Ukraine, mainly men. Poland has lost 100,000 workers, Ukrainian workers, who went back to fight. So you have to remember that there's a large amount of Ukrainians who have in the last month gone back because they feel it's their obligation. They didn't have to go back. They did cross the border to Ukraine to fight against Russia.
Okay, thank you. Now we are going to, I will remind that we have pending questions and reaction. Ms. U.W.I, if you can share with us about the issue of foreign national from Caribbean island. And I would like to take the opportunity now to share the last questions that we have, and that will be for Dr. the Most Reverend Archbishop Charles Jason Gordon. These questions has to do with the efforts that has been done by the Vatican, and what could you say to persons who agree with the Russian invasion or Putin sympathizers? So this is the order we are going to follow to end the question and answer session. First, very briefly, Ms. Ali, and then please, I would like to ask the Dr. Most Reverend Archbishop to take the floor, answer the question, and share his final thoughts. Please, Ms. Ali.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I will be brief because I could say that IOM usually monitors displacement and migration, and we're doing that in Ukraine as well as the major receiving states. But unfortunately, we don't have much information for the Caribbean. We are trying to gather data right now through the country offices, and we will, so we are trying, but we don't have any information at this time. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you so much. Please now, Dr. the Most Reverend Archbishop, please your reactions and comments on these questions and else that has been shared at the panel.
If they are Putin sympathizers, I would have to say to them that they're misplaced, because what Putin has done here is horrendous. There are war crimes involved. There is a sovereign nation that has its own desires for how it wants to see itself as a democratic nation. And in that sense, any nation invading another nation, like any bully in a play yard that starts a fight with another child, you have to say that this is wrong. And I have no qualification on that. It is wrong. The Vatican has tried mediation behind the scenes. The Holy Father has made very clear, very strong comments. He's attempted several interventions himself and behind the scenes, because we have to find a way to stop this war as quickly as possible. And I agree 100%. If Putin is successful in Ukraine, not only Poland, but many other nations after that, we're going to see embroiled in a war over a longer period of time. I would also say that all the former USSR and all the Eastern nations that have a desire for democracy, for the Western way of life, and for a Western style of economy, have a legitimate right and should be able to express that, and in a desire for joining NATO, etc., etc. The point I was making is a slightly different point. And the point is that if you look at it from the other perspective, there is a perspective there that also has to be heard. And if you look at it from the other perspective, then you can see how that blinds one to seeing or justifying what has happened. And I'm saying there's no justification. And what has happened is terrible. But I'm also saying that what we're looking at in the Ukraine crisis and in this war could well be a tipping point for the whole world order shifting one more time. And if that is true, then this could be embroiled in a much bigger conflict, one that I don't know how we get past it. Nuclear war is something that we've not really had. We've had nuclear bombs dropped, and the aftermath of that has been terrible. Nuclear war is something different. There is no comeback for humanity after that. And the threat that I am seeing is a threat that has to be dealt with, both from a developmental perspective, which means we have to also get into the mind of the other and try to see how it looks from their side, while we clearly understand how it looks from our side. And in that, we have to find a way towards peace here, because escalation beyond where we are now could be something that humanity as a whole moves into another stage of its existence. Look how climate change has been pushed off the stage because of this, and other crises around the world likewise. And this one, I fear it. And I suppose what you're hearing more is my deep concern that where the individual nations are suffering, and it is terrible, and it cannot be justified, we might be embroiled in something much, much bigger. that 100 years from now, we look back if humanity still exists and say, wow, how did we do that? And how did we not see all these pieces play? That's what I'd like to see. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We don't have more time to share more questions and answers, and I would like to take the opportunity again before proceeding to the closing moment and the vote of thanks. I would like to take the opportunity to thank again the panelists for taking the time, for taking the interest, and for sharing so much important information and insightful perspective on the conflict, the war that we are analyzing today. I would like now then to ask Ms. Darion Nareen to proceed to the first part of the vote of thanks. Mr. Nareen is a social development specialist, a professional performing artist, and he's also the chair of the task force responsible for executing the Commonwealth Youth Forum in Rwanda in June 22. Please, Mr. Nareen, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Chair. Indeed, I think everyone shares the same sentiments with me here in agreeing that this has truly been a very thought-provoking engagement. And in fact, it has really opened our eyes to the realities across the globe, but also made us realize that we live in a much more globalized society. And no longer can something that's happening across the globe not impact the entire world in ways that we don't even, that we are not even capable of measuring to its full and analyzing its full impact. So let me say congratulations to all the panelists, and we thank you all for being here with us this afternoon here to, of course, share your expertise and to share your insight as well on what is occurring in our global affairs and what is occurring with the Ukraine and Russia crisis. I just want to say a special thanks, of course, to our chair, Dr. LaGuardia Martinez, who's a lecturer and coordinator at the MPhil and PhD programs for IIR, and doing such a good job, of course, interconnecting and interwebbing all the conversations that we've had here this afternoon. A special thanks to Professor Jessica Byron, of course, director of the Institute, for hosting this event here for in collaboration with the CCSJ. And we're very happy that you agreed to come on board and to do this with us, and for, of course, giving you your opening remarks at the beginning and setting the tone. A special thanks to Ms. Reita Toussaint, the Permanent Secretary of the Ministry of Foreign and CARICOM Affairs, for also giving us an insight on how the Ukraine and Russia crisis really impacts local affairs here in Trinidad and Tobago, and of course across the Caribbean region and the CARICOM as well. Professor Pisarska, Chair of the Warsaw Security Forum, thank you so much for coming here, for joining us here, and for giving us a very on-the-ground perspective as well, being in the know and being very close to what is occurring and all the injustices that are happening there as well. Thank you so much for being here with us. Mr. Soldatich, Deputy Head of Delegation and Political Officer, thank you as well for sharing and giving us some insight from your personal perspective on the impact of this war, and also for sharing the perspectives, your perspective as well on what this global impact could mean for the entire globe. Ms. Jewel Ali, Head of Office and Project Coordinator for IOM, for giving us some insight into, of course, the migration crisis and what could be coming out of this massive humanitarian crisis, and what will be needed in order for us to regain some kind of firm footing on a global scale. We're seeing migration, of course, and migration due to disaster and crisis on the rise. So we know that, of course, having a firm understanding of what the implications could be of crisis like this is so important, especially when we have to now welcome, protect, and promote and integrate migrants from different countries across the globe. Ms. Leela Ramdeen, Episcopal Delegate and Chair of the CCSJ and AMMR, thank you for such a sobering perspective as well, not only highlighting the Ukraine migration and the migration of Ukrainian nationals and how that is impacting the world, but also giving us a very sobering perspective around the racism that we're seeing as well come to the fore during times of crisis, and makes us all question what are we doing as humanity to ensure that comes to the fore, and that we no longer see race or religion or class or sex in times of need and in crisis especially. And I want to say also a special thank you to, of course, Dr. Anita Montut from the IIR as well, and also a board member on the CCSJ for helping us in bringing this together and executing this forum. So thank you to all the panelists. And I know that there's a lot to discuss and a lot coming out from the discussions that have occurred here this afternoon as well. So I give my thanks and I hand back over to you, Chair.
Thank you so much, Mr. Noreen. And finally, I would like to invite Miss Giselle McIntyre, who is a student of the Master of Global Studies here at the University of the West Indies with 18 years of experience as multimedia journalist and media manager, to give the final vote of thanks.
Thank you all, and good afternoon to everyone. Do allow me to first acknowledge our chair, Dr. Jacqueline LaGuardia Martinez, also our prestigious guests and all our wonderful participants, whether you've joined us from here at home in Trinidad and Tobago or are tuning in from the wider Caribbean region and even further afield. I must say it is an honor indeed to have been asked to propose a vote of thanks on behalf of the Institute on this occasion. This joint IIR-CCSJ webinar would not have been made possible without a vast network of support and experts collaboration. So I must therefore thank the U.W.I Marketing and the Institute of International Relations Secretariat and IT team for ensuring the effectiveness of the interchange. And also special thanks indeed to both Drs. Putinski and Montut for their significant contributions in helping to organize this informative and very relevant event. Also allow me to express gratitude to the Catholic Commission for Social Justice for collaborating with the Institute of International Relations to make this event a reality, and also to the prestigious panelists for your presence, for your enlightenment and your expert contributions in making this webinar a great success. So thank you to everyone once again for your gracious presence.
Thank you so much, Giselle. And as a final moment, I would like to ask the panelists to please turn your cameras on. I believe most of you are here. Also to all the organizers that have been involved in this activity to take a group picture. And again, thanks to all of you for your time, your interest, and sharing your knowledge with us today. Really, really appreciate it. So please, Sarah, I will now allow you to take the final picture. And then I wish you the best of the evenings and a very happy rest of the week in the middle of these very difficult circumstances we live in.
Okay, Dr. LaGuardia, we'll just allow guests to leave.
Okay, thank you, Sarah. Thank you so much. Thank you to all our panelists again. It has been, I believe it has been a really useful